Hey everyone, tonight we start with a city that looks like a drunk architect made it. Venice. A city that shouldn't be there but is. Like a beautiful accident that has been holding itself together for 1,500 years. Before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And please tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from all over the world. Now, turn down the lights and maybe turn on a fan to make a soft noise in the background. And let's get ready for tonight's trip together. Venice used to be a swamp that was so bad that even mosquitoes needed therapy after they left. Now it is a beautiful city full of art and architecture. Picture marshes that go on forever, puddles of salt water, and mud that could eat your sandals. That was the lagoon in Venice. The only good thing about it was that no one else wanted it. In ancient Rome, this area wasn't as La Serenissima and more La Swampissima. The empire that built aqueducts over mountains and bathhouses heated by science looked at this soggy mess and said, "Nope." You can picture a Roman surveyor standing in the muck, sketching for a minute, then quietly tearing up the papyrus and going home early. Even so, the Romans couldn't help but mess with it a little. They put up some fishing posts and docks around the edges, mostly for the sake of trade and collecting taxes now and then. But they all knew this, too. Wasn't the right place for big statues. You can't really build a colosseum if your foundation shakes like pudding. They called the area Veneti, which means many, because there were a lot of small islands and probably a lot of bad decisions that went into living on them. People who lived there were fishermen, salt collectors, and people who had lost a bet with the gods. The lagoon did keep them safe, but it also caused them deep pain for all time. For hundreds of years, the area was just there, half land and half water, and it was always wet. Rome didn't pay attention to it. Historians didn't pay attention to it. Even people who came to attack it didn't pay attention to it. No one wanted to sack a place that already looked half-sacked. Then, in the 5th century, when the Roman Empire finally fell apart, like a lasagna that had been cooked too long, barbarians came through Italy and burned cities to the ground. The survivors looked around and thought, where can we go that no sane person would follow? Someone pointed to the lagoon, and that was the end of the problem. They waded in, built huts on stilts, and told themselves it was only temporary. How every bad decision starts. They had no idea they were starting a city that would last longer than empires. The marble in Rome broke, its temples fell down, its emperors became legends. For the swamp stayed. Venice didn't what up because of ambition or fate. It came about because of stubbornness in the water. The fall of the Roman Empire was like a marble building that forgot about gravity. Barbarians attacked Italy, burned cities, stole from churches, and gave historians a lot to write about for the next 1,500 years. There were two choices for the survivors. Either stay and die like a hero, or leave and live like a coward. Most people picked the second. They ran north into the marshy Venetian lagoon, which was so bleak that being exiled there felt like a day at the spa. Refugees from cities like Padua, Aquileia, and Alinum stumbled through waist-deep mud here and all agreed, "Fine, we live here now." That's how Venice began. There are a lot of people who are hiding from civilization on an island that didn't want them either. There was no solid ground, no farmland, and definitely no plan. These people lived in the city and were trying to stay alive in a floating compost heap. The first homes in Venice were shaky wooden huts that were built on planks that were held up by logs stuck in the mud. If the tide rose too high, your living room turned into a small lake inside. You can picture the first meetings. Should we go? No. The barbarians are still out there. Should we build in a drier place? No. That makes sense. So they stayed and hammered tree trunks into the lagoon one at a time, turning a swamp into a forest that was too thick to walk through. They didn't know it yet, but they were building the base for one of the strangest cities in history. The wood came from far away, from alpine forests where oak, alder, and larch grew. It was pulled by boat down rivers and across trade routes. Each log was a sign that this place might not sink before lunch. They stacked thousands of them on top of each other, one on top of the other, until the ground stopped squishing. That's how Venice got started, as a refugee camp that accidentally found out about civil engineering. People in Venice in the past weren't thinkers or architects. They were survivors who had hammers. They didn't care about how things looked. They didn't want to drown. But over the years, the wet platforms dried out, the logs turned to stone, and the city that seemed impossible began to take shape. There was never a plan for Venice. It was made up on the spot, the longest lasting temporary fix in the history of the world. And it somehow stayed. By the 6th century, the refugees had gone from being temporary squatters to unintentionally starting a civilization. Now they had to deal with the small problem of living on top of liquid mud. You can't just put cities on slime, not unless you're Venetian and very hopeful, at least. The bottom of the lagoon was a mess, soft clay, moving silt, and water that liked to move things around twice a day. Most people would have left. Venice said, "Let's double down," and they started, dripping millions of wooden piles deep into the ocean floor. Not a few dozen, not a few hundred, but millions. People had to use mallets the size of small trees to drive each one down by hand. It was more punishment for everyone than building, but it worked. Under every Venetian building is a forest, a secret empire of wood that has been driven into the ground and kept safe by the water that doesn't have oxygen. That's the key. The wood doesn't break down. It becomes stone after being mineralized by salt and pressure over hundreds of years. The palace, the towers, and the cafes where tourists now pay 14 euros for a cappuccino are all built on old wood that won't rot. Dead trees and denial are what Venice is built on. The second layer was made of Istrian limestone that was brought over from the other side of the Adriatic. This stone was so heavy that it didn't care about salt water. The Venetians put it over the piles to make platforms, which were like slabs of solid ground floating above the chaos. It was like building an apartment building on top of a Jenga tower in the Middle Ages and hoping for the best. But it worked again. Buildings started to go up, even though it went against all laws of common sense and hydrology. Over this unlikely base, churches, warehouses, and homes piled up. The skyline sparkled with potential and a little bit of craziness. The real miracle wasn't from God, it was about logistics. Think about how hard it would be to set up supply lines to feed, clothe, and house a city that is growing on islands, in water, with no land, no roads, and no time to waste. It took a boat to bring every nail, stone, and beam. It was planning for cities, in a slow way. But somehow Venice didn't go under. It just settled down nicely, like an old nobleman who won't admit he's drunk too much wine. The Roman Empire had fallen apart and gone away hundreds of years before, but it still wouldn't leave Venice alone. Rome was like that one ex who still affects your choices long after the breakup, haunting your infrastructure, your design choices, and sometimes even your plumbing. The first Venetians, who lived in the lagoon, were technically living among the empire's ruins. They cleaned up the ruins of the mainland cities after they fell. They loaded old Roman bricks, columns, and marble onto barges and sent them into the swamp. Rebuilding your city with someone else's leftovers is the best way to start over. Venice turned into a Frankenstein's monster of Roman recycling. There was a traveling circus of stolen architecture that brought every pillar, arch, and statue from somewhere else. People who couldn't keep Rome alive on land somehow brought it back to life on water. And the funny thing is that the pieces of Rome they saved would last longer than the real Rome. They also used arches, which were the empire's favorite way to build things. The Romans loved arches because they could hold up half the world with math and confidence. The Venetians took that idea and ran with it, or rather, paddled with it. They used arches all over the place to cross canals, strengthen walls, and hold up buildings that should have fallen down a long time ago. Of course, it was a nightmare to change Roman buildings to fit a lagoon. You can't really pour concrete when your floor moves twice a day. The answer is hydraulic improvisation. The Venetians made a cement that hardened when it was underwater by mixing lime, volcanic ash, and crushed stone. In short, Roman concrete's wet, emotionally unstable cousin. As Venice got bigger, it started to look like a shinier, smaller, and more boat-filled version of Rome. There were basilas, forums, and squares, all made of borrowed genius and soggy wood. People who were rethought Rome's greatness. I'm just trying not to die. That's what makes early Venice so special. It didn't come up with any new engineering. It just reused Rome's with better waterproofing. Rome conquered continents, but Venice conquered buoyancy. So even though the empire fell apart, its spirit lived on in the lagoon, where it was carved into every column and encoded into every bridge. Rome was built on rock, and Venice was built on faith, wood, and a complete lack of understanding of how water works. Somehow, by the 8th century, the swamp had turned into a skyline. The impossible had made neighborhoods, canals, and street plans that were only half crazy. The city of Venice, which was built by accident, was now real. No one planned it. It happened the same way that mold does when you don't pay attention to it for a long time. Huts that were muddy turned into villages. Villages became islands, and bridges and trade routes connected islands to each other. It didn't look like an architectural plan at all. It looked more like a coral reef that grew slowly, naturally, and against all logic. Venice didn't rise, it grew. The the number of people grew quickly. Fishermen turned into merchants, refugees became nobles, and the lagoon, which used to be a place for scared Romans to hide, became a floating empire run by people who had no plans to ever step foot on dry land again. The people of Venice didn't own land, they were the lords of the water. Of course, the engineering nightmare never stopped. The mud still moved, the wood still creaked, and every few years, the sea tried to take the property back. But Venetians were professionals. Stubborn just changed. They made more stacks, more platforms, and more prayers. Churches were built on wooden foundations so strong that they could hold up marble domes without falling down, at least on weekdays. The first canals turned into highways. Boats carried people, things, gossip, and even the occasional body from one end of the lagoon to the other. Before traffic lights, it was urban flow management, and it only worked because everyone was just as lost. Venice also came up with its own strange way to stay alive. Because water, why build walls when everything was already there? The wall was the sea. Invaders couldn't get to them without either drowning or getting sidetracked by seafood. The lagoon was both a moat and a miracle. It was a natural defense system made entirely out of trouble. In the year 800, the city chose its first doge, who was basically a fancy-hatted mayor, and said it was free from both empires and reality. Venice had come, a city of salt and strategy, wood and wealth, that somehow managed to live between two things, land and water, disorder and order, and all it took was centuries of hard work, constant worry, and blind faith in wood. Venice went from a muddy refugee camp to a busy aquatic tax haven by the 9th century. The people who lived in the swamp had become traders, sailors, and politicians who saw water as a chance to make money and probably a few unpaid docking fees. Venice wasn't built on land, so it didn't act like a city on land. There were no walls, farms, or horses. It had gondolas, sailors, and people who could walk better on boats than they could walk. It was a city built by fish for people who didn't want to drown. The lagoon that used to keep enemies out is now a way to get to the rest of the world. The Venetians turned their swamp into a naval empire by building ships faster than other countries could sink them. They traded everything from spices to silk to mild political corruption between their fleets that linked Constantinople, Egypt, and the rest of Europe. Every dockyard was a mess of noise. Hammers pounding, ropes breaking, sailors yelling, and someone always falling in. The Venetians became experts in maritime engineering, making ships that were light, fast, and able to outrun pirates and outsmart their competitors. These people weren't just traders. They were accountants who sold weapons, and the city was booming, not just in terms of business, but also in terms of sound. The building never stopped. Palaces grew out of the lagoon like coral reefs that had been covered in marble. As soon as a family made money, they tried to show it off by building a house that was a little taller, shinier, or less useful than the houses next door. If your house didn't threaten to fall down because it was so nice, were you even Venetian? The economy was also doing well, mostly because Venice came up with capitalism while pretending it was a civic duty. The Doge ruled with style, the merchants ruled with books, and the common people ruled with rumors. They made a government so complicated that it made Rome look like a lemonade stand. Venice didn't have any natural resources, farmland, or there is no army, just ships, ambition, and trust in the sea. That was enough in some way. Venice wasn't just getting by the 11th century, it was doing well. The swamp people had turned into the water people, who were the middlemen of the medieval world. They didn't take over land, they took over logistics. And that was a lot more profitable in the Middle Ages. It's easy to understand why there are no streets in Venice. They tried, but the streets sank. The city quickly figured out that wheels were useless in a place where the ground acts like pudding. Wheels were useless for pudding, so they picked boats. Boats don't care about floods, and they don't need paving. A win-win for any society that is built on mud. So Venice changed the way cities are planned. The Venetians dug channels while the rest of Europe was fighting over cobblestones. Water routes ran through every neighborhood like veins in a living thing. The canals weren't just for looks. They were roads, sewers, and sometimes even bathtubs. At first, it wasn't very nice. Early canals were mostly ditches full of sadness. But the Venetians, who were stubborn perfectionists, dug them out and reshaped them until the lagoon became a grid system for water. They put stone walls along the edges, making the marshy mess into a beautiful place to walk. What began as engineering for survival turned into urban poetry. That's how the gondola came to be. It is sleek, quiet, and just the right width to fit through alleys that are also rivers. Each one was made by hand and was not symmetrical to make up for the fact that the rower only had one oar. It was the Middle Ages. Like a luxury sports car, but with a faint smell of salt and existential dread. The tides changed the course of life. Boats brought things like deliveries, funerals, and weddings. People even fought in the middle of the canal, with gondolers yelling insults at each other instead of hitting each other. People stopped walking in Venice. They moved smoothly. Of course, this also meant that you couldn't just leave your house without risking a swim. One wrong move, and you were in the fish ecosystem. Before they could run, kids learned how to row, and yet everything worked out. Venice's identity was the canals. Venice was clean, shiny, and a little smug about it, while other medieval cities were choking on smoke and mud. The water that once threatened to drown them now held their money, art, and attitude. Venice had done the unthinkable. It didn't build civilization on top of nature. It built it with nature, a partnership between human madness and tidal patience. It wasn't. Not just a city anymore. It was a floating test of how to control chaos. Venice stopped acting humble by the 12th century. The city that used to hide from barbarians was now showing off marble palaces and bell towers, all of which stood on water. It was as if the Venetians looked at the laws of physics and said, "We hear you, we just don't care." Venetian architecture was born out of defiance, not of enemies, but of gravity. The builders knew that the foundations were made of wood, stilts stuck in the mud, but they chose to put several tons of limestone and marble on top. In any case, it's the kind of hope that only people who live in denial every high tide could have. Every building was a risk. The Due's Palace, the Basilica di San Marco, and the long line of palazzi along the Grand Canal are all proof of how proud people can be and how well they can waterproof things. There were Byzantine mosaics, Gothic arches, and so much decoration on every facade that it made Rome jealous. The result is a skyline that looks like it could fall over at any moment, but it won't because it doesn't want to. People who weren't from Venice thought it was magical. People who lived there thought it was just stressful. The city was literally being dragged down by all that beauty. They called it subsidence, which means a slow motion collapse. Or, as modern engineers would say, "We told you so." But the Venetians didn't stop. They built their floating empire even bigger, stacking palaces on top of each other like pancakes and carving windows that looked like dreams. Architects were obsessed with light and how it bounced off canals, bounced off marble, and blinded diplomats who came to visit just enough to get them to sign bad trade deals. Everything in Venice was made to look good. Churches that sparkled in the morning, bridges that bent with impossible grace, and squares paved like chessboards for rich people to walk on, pretending they weren't standing on a glorified raft. It wasn't useful. It was a play. Venice wasn't made to last. It was made to work. Every brick, every statue, and every ripple of water in the mirror said the same thing. Yes, this is crazy, and yes, it's working. Venice built palaces on water, while the rest of Europe built castles on hills. If you're going to put everything on the line for a swamp, you might as well make it look great. Even though Venice is beautiful, it has always had a bad relationship with the sea. The lagoon gives, the lagoon takes things away, usually by flooding your living room. The same water that brought trade to Venice showed off its palaces and kept the barbarians away, and also quietly ate the city from below, molecule by molecule. Salt water is the slowest and most annoying killer in nature. It seeps into brick, eats away at stone, and leaves behind a crust of shining ruin. Every day, the tide licked the city's foundations like a cat testing its prey, waiting for the moment when gravity would give up. The Venetians called it aqua alta, which means high water. In reality, it was just the sea reminding them who was in charge. The Venetians became obsessive about keeping things in order to stay alive. The medieval version of people who vacuum before guests come over, but their guests were floods. They scraped barnacles off, put in new piles, to replace the ones that were falling apart and filled in cracks with lime and prayers. The city hired whole crews to argue with the ocean all day. Stone was the most hurt. The well-known Istrian limestone was chosen for its strength and could withstand salt longer than most marriages, but it did give in eventually. The lower walls of buildings started to fall apart, and palaces became salt lick sculptures. People got used to it. They moved their furniture upstairs, not because they wanted to, but because the lagoon had taken over the downstairs. People in Venice didn't panic. They came up with new ideas. They put up water barriers, raised thresholds, and put in secret floodgates in churches that were meant to show humility. They got really good at denial. If the water rose, they would literally pretend that the city had a second floor. But in the quiet hours after a storm, when the moonlight shone on the flooded piazzas, Venice looked like a dream. It was beautiful because it was fragile, and proud because it was going to die. The enemy in the salt water never gave up, but the Venetians were too. Their fight wasn't about winning, it was about being able to last. A battle between architecture and chemistry that has lasted for hundreds of years. Conquest, plague, or neglect are the main reasons why most cities die. The same thing that made Venice rich is slowly destroying it, and the people still drink espresso while their floors shine underwater. They say the city's unofficial motto, "It could be worse, at least it's not," raining. By the 1300s, Venice was more than just a city. It was an empire that was still learning how to ride. While everyone else in Europe was fighting over land, Venice was busy writing laws, counting money, and pretending that wood doesn't sink. This floating test had somehow become a working republic. The government of Venice was a bureaucratic work of art. It was a mix of democracy, aristocracy, and group therapy. The Doge, who was elected for life, was at the top, but mostly stuck in ceremonies and fancy hats. There were councils, committees, subcommittees, and the Council of Ten, which sounds like a band, but was actually the most powerful political group in Europe. It dealt with spying, bribery, and the rare case of someone going missing without a trace, all in writing, of course. There were special problems with running a republic on stilts. There weren't any walls around the city, no farms, and not much solid ground to hide things on. So Venice became obsessed with contracts, treaties, and paper. Maritime codes, all neatly stored away while the floorboards creaked under their weight. The city was called a masterpiece of order built on chaos by diplomats. They were right. Venetian politics were based on two things: trade and fear. The city's power came from the sea, which was just as unpredictable as its enemies. Everyone in the country was a merchant and a spy. Ships moved slower than news, and gossip was worth money. You didn't just sell salt or silk, you sold information. Venice, in a nutshell, made LinkedIn, but with more water. The economy, on the other hand, did well. The arsenal, Venice's shipyard, could build a galley in a single day, long before mass production became a popular term. Picture an assembly line that runs on hammers, rope, and loud opinions. Every day, ships left port with goods, soldiers, and sometimes bad morals. And through it all, the city stayed balanced, in a literal sense. The same creaking foundations that held up palaces now held up the government. Every choice, every law, every compromise that was made by piling kept Venice afloat in more ways than one. The Republic of Venice didn't come from a set of beliefs. It came from planning. It worked not because it was right or fair, but because it was planned in a ruthless, beautiful way with just the right amount of corruption to keep things interesting. To put it simply, Venice didn't get bigger by taking over other places. It got bigger because of paperwork. By the 15th century, Venice was in its Renaissance period, which was the best time for art, money, and ego to all come together. The city was so rich that it was hard to believe, with trade profits and moral flexibility shining through. It didn't have any land, an army, or fresh water, but it did have painters, philosophers, and a lot of people who thought marble could fix anything. Venetian nobles started to compete with each other to see who could build the most beautiful house on the weakest foundation. Yes, you could say that my palace leans a little, but check out the reflection. The Grand Canal turned into an architectural catwalk where every facade screamed, "I'm rich, please notice before I." This was also the time of Palladio, Titian, and Tintoretto, three men who painted, built, and decorated as if the city wasn't falling apart around them. Mosaics made from crushed gemstones lit up churches, and ceilings became oil-painted heavens. Venice became a work of art that was based on fear. Of course, all that beauty came with a lot of weight, literally tons of it. Every new palace pushed harder into the mud, which made the city sink faster. It was like overdrafting your architectural credit card in the Renaissance. Card. Engineers begged for calm. Artists laughed and asked for more marble. In the meantime, the lagoons started to get back at them. Salt got into everything, including the walls, the art, and even people's shoes. The lower floors of buildings became homes for amphibians, and the city started a new trend, always being wet. Still, no one cared. Venice had turned into Europe's mirror, a city of light, reflection, and sweet denial. People who came to see it called it the jewel of the sea. People who lived there called it Tuesday. The whole place sparkled as if it were between divine inspiration and structural failure. But even though the beauty was perfect, something was breaking underneath it. The trade routes were changing. The Ottoman Empire was getting stronger, and the city's money was starting to disappear like fog. The Golden Age sparkled because no one wanted to say that the tide was rising. Venice, with all of her painted beauty, had built her Renaissance on borrowed time and wood. The city wasn't going against gravity anymore. It was working out a deal with it, one tide at a time. There was a problem in Venice, and this time there wasn't any flooding. It was about logistics. The Grand Canal had become the main road in the city by the 16th century. Big, beautiful, and very hard to get across. There were ferries, but they were slow, wet, and smelled like wet democracy. People wanted a bridge. Most cities would just build one and be done with it. But Venice argued about it for decades because every architect knew that putting a stone. It was hopeful to build a bridge over water that was moving and resting on mud. But they decided to do it anyway, in true Venetian style, with style and the most risk. The Rialto Bridge was finished in 1591, the most beautiful engineering risk in Renaissance Europe. It was a single stone arch that spanned 24 meters across the Grand Canal and was perfectly balanced on thousands of wooden piles below. People who didn't like it said it would fall apart right away. Engineers said it couldn't be done. The people of Venice said, "Hold my wine." It took them 3 years to build it. No scaffolding, no steel, and no room for mistakes. Just math, marble, and too much confidence. When the bridge opened, people carefully walked across it, expecting something bad to happen. But the thing wouldn't fall, as if gravity itself was too impressed to get involved. The Rialto was more than just a bridge, it was a stage. There were shops on both sides selling jewelry, silk, and probably too expensive souvenirs. Even then, it linked the two hearts of the city, the market of San Polo and the beauty of San Marco, in one grand show of pride and grace. Other cities built bridges to cross things. Venice built one to show off. It was like a flex post in the Renaissance. Take a look at me. I'm standing on physics. And of course, it quickly became famous. Travelers were amazed by how impossible it was to curve. People used it as a great place to hear gossip, and artists painted it over and over again. The Rialto Bridge didn't just link two parts of Venice, it linked hundreds of years of craziness into one stone arch and one ego. Even now, when tourists crowd its steps to take selfies, they're standing on a 400-year-old reminder that being arrogant can sometimes pay off. Most of the time, it sinks. But in Venice, it seems to stay on top. By the end of the Renaissance, Venice was the most beautiful science experiment in the world. The city wasn't just built close to the water, it was built with it, on it, and sometimes even under it. Every tide, storm, and full moon reminded me that living here took faith and physics. The Venetians then became scientists, not the kind that wears lab coats, but the kind that wears wet boots and doesn't trust gravity. They looked at tides, salinity, and sediment flow long before anyone came up with the term hydrology. They knew exactly how much silt the rivers brought in and how much the sea took out. Venice was more than just getting by in the lagoon. It was like taking care of a relationship that needed a lot of work. The biggest problem was dirt. Rivers dumped tons of it into the lagoon, which was a threat. To make Venice a swamp again, like it was when it first started. What did the people of Venice do? They changed the course of the rivers. Not in a metaphorical sense, but in a real sense. They made new channels for the Brena and Pava rivers to flow away from the lagoon. Men in tights changed the environment on a godlike scale. These projects were, of course, risky. Changing the course of rivers could easily flood nearby towns, but that wasn't a problem for Venice. Those towns were on land, so they didn't matter. Then the floodgates opened. Wooden walls meant to keep the worst tides from coming in. They weren't perfect, but they made people feel like they were in charge, which is all people have ever wanted from nature. The engineers in Venice were the first to look at the ocean and say, "You work for me now." The city's need for balance was both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. Everything, from tides to trade to architecture to politics, was a delicate balance that had to be constantly changed. If you made one mistake, you'd wake up, having a fish farm instead of a bedroom. But the system worked in some way. The foundations held, the canals stayed open, and the city kept floating through history in a way that seemed impossible. Venice didn't win the sea. It politely talked to it over and over again for 600 years. It wasn't really an empire. It was more of a plan to keep things going for hundreds of years. It was the most beautiful repair job in the world. In the 16th century, Venice was at its best as a theater. It was rich, beautiful, and had no idea that it was putting on its own slow motion show. Sadness. The city was a superstar that was starting to go bad. Perfect on the outside, but falling apart on the inside. Trade was going down, empires were changing, and the lagoon was changing from a protector to a predator. But Venice's favorite art form was denial. The merchants saw fewer ships. There were more floods that the engineers saw. The nobles didn't see a thing. They were too busy hiring artists to paint pictures of themselves and acting like they didn't care. The truth was easy to see. Venice was going down, not in a figurative or symbolic way, in a literal sense. The wooden piles under the city were still strong, but the ground around them wasn't. The clay got smaller, the water level went up. Every 100 years, the city started to settle lower, like a lord who has had too much wine. There were signs of the disease all over. Doors that used to open onto the street now opened into the water. The lower floors were no longer usable, so the Venetians just moved upstairs and called it a renovation. The city quietly changed what it expected. Engineers came up with ideas, like raising the streets and building, higher walls and more prayer. Each one helped for 10 years, but then the sea shrugged and came back stronger. It turned out that nature didn't care about negotiating architecture, but instead of giving up, Venice made its decay into an art form. Artists painted its soft light, its sad quietness, and its shimmering reflections of destruction. People who wrote about it said it was a city stuck between life and memory. In reality, it was stuck between tides. Even the tourists, who were dressed in lace and idealism at first, loved it more because it was so fragile. Venice became Europe's favorite dying beauty, sad, beautiful, and a little wet. The Venetians, on the other hand, acted like pros. The government still met, the gondoliers still fought, and the Doge still waved politely from balconies that were slowly disappearing. Venice wasn't falling apart all at once. It was practicing falling apart for an indefinite amount of time. A city that is too proud to die quickly. It was still beautiful, rich, and silly, but it was wetter. The engineers wrote down what they saw. The sea kept clapping while the poets cried. Venice knew how to make even drowning look graceful. 500 years later, Venice is still there, or at least it looks like it's about to fall down. The same wooden piles that were driven into the mud 1,000 years ago are still there, holding up a dream of the Renaissance that won't admit it's mostly luck. It's a miracle of staying strong and making bad plans. The city never really beat nature. It just dealt with it every day, like a tired marriage. The ocean goes up. Venice changes. The salt eats. Venice gets new paint. There are floods. Venetians don't care and order espresso. There is a fight between human pride and the physics of water in every part of the city. Engineers today call it subsidence. People in the area call it Tuesday. The streets are flooded, the tourists are scared, and the gondoliers keep singing like everything is fine because it is for them. For hundreds of years, they've been living in a slow apocalypse. When you've seen whole empires disappear into the waves of time, a little high tide doesn't. Not scare you, Venice's beauty isn't what makes it special. It's not dying the right way. It's too proud, too stubborn, and too aware that the world is still watching. The city that started out as a refugee camp in a swamp turned into a republic, an empire, an art gallery, and finally a warning about building near water. And yet it lasts. Every bridge and canal is part of a dance that has been going on for hundreds of years, balancing ambition and decay. The same marble that amazed people in the Renaissance still shines at sunset. Its reflection ripples in the canals like time itself, and it laughs softly. The city might go down, but its image never does. Venice is not a statue, it's a show, one that has been going on for 1,500 years without stopping. The actors change, the water rises, and the set bends a little, but the show goes on. Maybe that's the most important thing to learn from Venice. You don't have to beat nature, you just need good lighting, good balance, and the confidence to keep acting like everything is fine. The rest is just upkeep. In the foggy Albor Mountains, where the wind whispered through stone and legend, a fortress called Alamut protected more than just walls. It protected an idea. To the average person, it was the eagle's nest, a fortress that no one could see or get to, ruled by men who spoke softly but made empires tremble. From here, the mysterious old man of the mountain, Hassani Sabah, made not just a sect, but a myth that would spread across continents. The Hashashin, or Nisari Ismails, as they really were, came into being in the 11th century as a result of the splits in Islam itself. In the middle of the political chaos between Sunni Abbasids and Shia Fatimids, Hassan built something radical, a disciplined order that was not based on blood, but on purpose. They promised to be completely loyal to him, to the cause of divine knowledge, and to a dream of spiritual freedom that scared both kings and caliphs. Training was hard. Recruits lived like monks, learning philosophy, theology, and how to sneak in. They didn't fight wars with armies, but wars of waiting. They thought that one sword in the right place could change the balance of power between nations. To their enemies, they were ghosts in white robes who struck out of nowhere, left a message carved in fear, and then disappeared into the mist of the mountains. But the name Hashin, which is where the word assassin comes from, was a gift from the government. Hassan's enemies said that his followers were given hashish before missions so that they could see paradise in their hallucinations and not be afraid of death. Later, Marco Polo took that tale to Europe, saying that they had heard of gardens full of hurries and rivers of wine, where these murderers thought they would wake up after they died. But the truth was much more serious and scary. The true strength of the Hashin was not in its ability to get people drunk, but in its ability to think. They got into courts, traded information, and made murder a part of their plans. If a kaif, crusader, or vizier woke up to find a dagger next to his pillow, it was a warning, not a death sentence. We, the message said, could have killed you. Next time, we will. From those mountain fortresses, a web of fear and interest spread. Even though centuries would bury them, their name, which was half myth and half memory, would live on in every empire that tried to erase it. There was a man named Hassani Saba, who was a scholar, strategist, and zealot before the story of daggers and gardens. Hassan was born in Kay, Persia, around 150. He grew up in a world of scholars and theologians, where faith and politics were always at odds with each other. He was a gifted, smart, strict, and completely sure that reason guided by faith was the only way to find the truth. He learned from the Fatimids in Cairo and took in the teachings of the Ismaili sect. Even among fanatics, Hassan was one of a kind. People respected him for his intelligence, but they also sent him away. The Fatimid Caliph in Cairo kicked Hassan out because he was worried about his ambition. This would ironically make him Hassan's most dangerous enemy. Hassan ran east, moving like a ghost through Persia until he found his. The fortress of Alamut, which was like a falcon's perch above the world, was a safe place. He took control of it in 1090 without spilling a drop of blood by using wit, persuasion, and maybe even a little manipulation. The story goes that he sneaked into the fortress dressed as a teacher and turned the soldiers one by one until the castle itself bowed to him. Once Hassan got inside, he made Alamut more than just a fort. It turned into a university, a monastery, and a center for intelligence all at once. Every disciple was carefully picked and checked. They taught the young men theology, philosophy, and languages, but they also taught them how to hide, sneak around, and kill perfectly. He told people not to indulge, told them to be quiet, and preached that martyrdom was not death, but joining with God. His men were so loyal that they would jump from towers when he told them to, which shocked outsiders and made his power last forever. Hassan didn't lead with fear, he led with faith as a weapon. He was in charge for 35 years without leaving. Alamut used to run things from afar by sending letters, coded messages, and whispers to loyal couriers. Under his command, assassinations were precise. His ideas led to the deaths of viziers, generals, and even Seljuk princes by daggers. Hassan's enemies thought he was a crazy person pretending to be holy. He was proof to his followers that absolute discipline could lead to divine truth. In the dark rooms of Alamut, he became both a prophet and a puppeteer, the mind behind the myth that would one day scare the whole medieval world. Discipline was like scripture inside the stone walls of Alamut. Hassan Isaba's beliefs called for more than just faith. It necessitated the relinquishment of the self. The men who came to serve him had no family, money, or sense of self. They became feeders, people who give up things. Death was not punishment for them, it was the end of their lives. Hassan was a genius at turning belief into obedience so strong that even empires were afraid to say his name. The training for each new member didn't start with, not weapons, but silence. They learned how to wait, watch, and fast. They learned passages from the Quran and from his smiley philosophy by heart until their minds became weapons. They were only taught the blade when their minds were sharp. Every move was part of a ritual: the drawing of the dagger, the blow, and the retreat. Failure was not an option. People who were unsure never came back from their missions, and those who made it became living shadows. The Hashin wasn't dangerous because it was strong. It was exactness. Their attacks were personal, surgical, and theatrical, unlike the wild raids of crusaders or the masked armies of sultans. They didn't kill for fun or to steal. They murdered to send messages. One assassination could stop an invasion, end a feud, or change the policy of a dynasty overnight. Long before the term existed, Hassan had set up the first psychological warfare network. But their beliefs were not chaos. Hassan's killers had strict moral rules to follow. They picked their targets. With thought, men who broke promises, persecuted the Ismailis, or threatened their lives were often the ones who did it. It was against the law to kill for no reason. It was wrong to die without a reason. Over time, their methods caused fear that was almost superstitious. The knife left on a pillow, the voice in the dark, the story of a man smiling before he died. All of them became Hashin signatures. Even tough generals would pray before bed, scared that a servant or bodyguard might already be one of Hassan's. To people who didn't know them, they were crazy people. But in the halls of Alamut, they thought of themselves as soldiers of truth. People who thought that one act of selflessness could clean up a world that was full of corruption. Their beliefs were simple but strong. The blade does not serve hate, it serves fate. And in that, they found both peace and purpose. The name Hashashin had already started to creep through the halls of power like a chill by the early 11th century. The first confirmed murders were not random acts of terror, but planned killings carried out with almost perfect timing. Hassani Saba's men didn't just kill, they killed. Every strike was both a message and a miracle, showing how far they could reach and making fun of every fortress, guard, and army on earth. Their first big target was Nisam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuk Empire. He had a lot of power in both Persia and Syria. In 1092, a lone feeder, dressed as a wandering dervish, approached the vizier's litter under the pretense of delivering a petition. The vizier unrolled the assassin stabbed him in the heart with a dagger. Guards quickly shot the Fed, but the message had already been sent. The mountains could reach even the strongest minister. The news of the murder spread quickly, and with it came a sense of awe. The Hashashin didn't have armies, but they were better at using fear as a weapon than any army. They used surgical intelligence to mix faith, politics, and theater into a powerful formula. Each mission was meant to echo, too, whisper through the courts of both sultans and crusader kings. Soon, killing people became diplomacy. Princes who had once cursed Hassan's name started sending him gifts, hoping to buy safety. There were rumors that the Hashashin had spies in every royal court, and that no oath or alliance was safe. People in faraway Jerusalem even whispered about them, thinking they were invisible servants of death. But Hassan wasn't careless. Each strike was planned to cause the most fear with the least amount of bloodshed: killing. One ruler could stop 10 armies in their tracks, and putting a warning dagger on a pillow could do more than kill a lot of people. Hassan's real genius was not in killing people, but in threatening to do so. The outcome was strange. Fear leads to peace. People in villages near Alamut slept soundly and weren't affected by the war because everyone knew that crossing Hassan's path meant disappearing from history. It was controlled by a story. Hassan was its unseen emperor, ruling the world from his eagle's nest with only whispers and blades. When Marco Polo, 200 years later, he went through the East and brought with him one of history's most enduring and misleading legends. He said that Hassani Saba used an earthly paradise, a secret garden full of wine, women, and wonder, to get young men to work for him. The initiates would wake up in this fake Eden after being given hashish, thinking they had seen the rewards of martyrdom. Hassan would tell them, "Serve me, and you will return to paradise forever." It was a story for medieval Europe about how the East was corrupt and clever like the devil. But while it fascinated people from Venice to Paris, the truth was less interesting and much smarter. There is no record in any Persian or Arabic source of such a garden ever existing. The myth probably came from hostile historians who wanted to show the Ismailis as heretics who were high on drugs and illusions. To the Sunni orthodoxy, calling them hashish users, hashisin, was a way to take away their legitimacy and turned a disciplined religious order into a group of crazy people. But, like all good propaganda, the story had a kernel of psychological genius hidden in it. Hassan didn't need drugs to get people to follow him. He had made his own heaven by believing. His fortress at Alamut was meant to look like it was perfect. Fertile terraces, clear streams, libraries full of books, and halls that echoed with debate instead of drunkenness. In a way, Hassan had built Eden not of physical pleasure, but of intellectual and spiritual growth. The myth of the hashish garden persisted, elucidating what outsiders failed to grasp: how men could confront death with unwavering composure and serene expressions. It was easier for crusaders and chroniclers to believe in drugged obedience than in spiritual conviction. So the name assassins, which came from lies, would become their eternal brand. Her son never set the record straight. He didn't have to. Let kings think that his men were demons. Let historians think they were. People who dream about paradise smoke. The more unbelievable a story is, the more powerful it is. The old man of the mountain knew the first rule of myth-making in that silence. People believe the lie that scares them more than the truth that comforts them. The Crusaders who stormed into the Holy Land in the late 11th century thought they would find clear lines of loyalty, Muslims on one side, Christians on the other. Instead, they found a world where loyalties were broken, alliances changed, and one strange. The Hashashin, a group that seemed to only care about themselves. They were a mystery wrapped in darkness, neither holy friend nor enemy. At first, the Crusaders thought they were just mountain bandits, but then bodies started to show up. Men's bodies were too strong to fall so easily. The most famous case was the murder of Conrad of Montferrara, king-elect of Jerusalem, in 1192. As he walked through the narrow streets of Tyre, two assassins dressed as monks came up to him. They said hello to him politely and then took out their daggers. They stabbed him under their robes and then were cut down. The Crusaders thought this was the worst thing that could happen. It was just business for the Hashin. The Templars and Hospitallers quickly figured out that the assassins could be friends or enemies, depending on who paid them. People say that Richard the Lionheart talked to them, and Saladin himself survived several attempts on his life. After an attack that didn't work, he is said to have woken up to find a dagger and a note on his pillow. You are in our strength. The message was more than just a threat. It reminded people that even the powerful sultan was human. The Hashashin became a political wild card because they were so neutral. They went after leaders of both Christians and Muslims, but not because of their faith, only because of their goals. Some chroniclers of the Crusades even admired them, saying how brave they were and how calm they were when they faced death. Others, who were scared, said they were demons who lived in the mountains and worshipped false gods. They had an effect on more than just swords and politics. They brought the idea of the invisible killer to Europe. This is the man who moves without being seen, acts alone, and brings down empires with one well-placed strike. That idea would live on long after the sect itself was gone, affecting everything from medieval paranoia to modern spying. The Hashashin were a puzzle to the Crusaders that didn't make sense in a chivalrous way. They fought without flags, prayed without priests, and killed without soldiers. A mirror held up to the pride of kings and knights who thought that power could only come from force. Alamut was not just a fort. It was a message written in stone. It seemed to defy the world below from its high perch in the Ehlers' mountains. A fortress built not just for fighting, but also for thinking. Crusader castles had a lot of towers and catapults, but Alamut's library was its best weapon. Hassani Saba brought together scholars, astronomers, and philosophers from all over Persia and beyond to create a place of learning in a time of ignorance. The Hashin were not just murderers, they were people who thought. Science and faith went hand in hand at Alamut. Along with theology and covert tactics, students learned about math, astronomy, medicine, and the art of logic. Some stories say that there were huge collections of manuscripts that kept the works of Greek, Persian, and Arab thinkers safe. Hassan, even though he was very strict, thought that knowledge was the best way to worship and ignorance was the worst sin. Life in Alamut was as strict as life in a monastery. every second had. Goal. The feeders trained without talking. Scholars argued about how the universe was put together, and scribes copied important texts by the light of a lamp. The atmosphere was strange. It was both cold and alive, secretive and curious. People outside thought it was a place of sin and pleasure, but inside it was more like a university run by beauty. Hassan ruled with an iron fist. There wasn't even much laughter. No music or wine was allowed. It was required to talk and study. But despite this rigidity, he did something amazing. He,